Hello, Thermoclide here again. Since hearing about Briffault's law a while ago within the MRM, it has never really sat right with me. To some degree I can see that it has apt explanations of a woman's behavior, but I do however think that it does have its restrictions. Now I know that some of you may be thinking I'm throwing out the already tiresome, not all women are like that. I assure you it's not what I'm doing here. Instead, I want to put forward the perspective of women's changing behavior between now and the past with respect to Briffault's law. Let's begin with what Briffault's law states. Also, let's just for now exempt whether Briffault's law should even really be considered a law. I quote, "The female, not the male, determines all the conditions of the animal family. Where the female can derive no benefit from association with the male, no such association takes place." Considering the very real and serious negative behavior from women, it's then not really surprising to make the initial conclusion that Briffault's law is an apt method in explaining the typical egotistical woman in this current time. It also gets me thinking what conditions might be present in the minority of women who do appear to be taming their hypergamous desires. Given the implications, I do really like to be careful about any proposed law that attempts to claim inherent behavior in people. Incidentally, whether you're a man or a woman, there is always going to be reasons of self-interest in a relationship. Each partner is complementary to each other, so it's the role of each to reciprocate affection, or what is simply described as love. Plus, whether you're a man or a woman, if no benefit from association takes place, then neither will maintain that association. However, the ever-increasing gold-digging attitude, whether it's conscious or subconscious, is not what I consider to be love. From here on, I will be chiefly addressing behavioral issues from women with respect to a hypergamous theme. It is my opinion that the details described in Briffault's law are a result of poor discipline and regulation of behavior in women that leads to such negative behavioral characteristics. Just imagine, for instance, the behavior of a child. It doesn't even really matter what sex you choose to imagine. I will leave that one up to you. While some kids are a lot better than others, let's consider the trivial and very childish acts performed by kids as a result of negative behavior. Such negative behavior like dishonesty, greed, and jealousy. Now let's suppose parents, teachers, and society did nothing to discourage these behaviors and instead tolerated it. What do you suppose would come of this? Well, from my own educated guess, I'd be willing to bet that said negative behavior will then extend into that child's adult life. Within the context of society, dishonesty, greed, and jealousy is acknowledged to be negative behavior, though from a purely independent perspective, for any individual who uses them, they then can earn certain benefits in that behavior, thus making said negative behavior into something positive for primarily that individual. You see, it is no accident as to why I chose a child in this imagined thought experiment, because I want to emphasize to you all that all people have inherent nasty behaviors for independent survival. When I think about it, it is actually rather simple to postulate some kind of sex-specific or universal negative behavior in people. On the other hand, often when we see negative behavior in people, we don't immediately conclude that behavior to be a barrier of biology. Instead, we conclude that said person lacks discipline, values, morality, and honor. Despite the fact that dishonesty, greed, and jealousy are inherent in all of us, we have also learned, be it by society, parents, and/or consequences, that these behaviors ought to be disdained. As a collective community, we have understood that these behaviors, while perhaps beneficial to our species in the past, now only acts to segregate us and considerably slow our efforts in noble endeavors. Likewise, I think that the negative hypergamous nature of women has been better controlled by women's morality and by social pressures in the past. I'd also like to note that hypergamy isn't necessarily bad in and of itself, but when it's left to its own devices in the context of a greater society, it then begins to do more harm than good, thus inducing negative behavior. Notably, in Western society, the typical woman hasn't always been as egotistically driven for materials and status. Let's just consider some major changes that have occurred between the last and current century. For one, marriages during my father's youth were typically longer lasting. In addition to that, any divorces are followed by shame and guilt. Secondly, with the fair exception of widows, single mothers were also shamed and guilted by society, though this was primarily in effect to protect the interest of children. Thirdly, being a slut was also a great shame that induced guilt, particularly if caught. And to quickly sum, being a heavy drinker and dressing scantily typically induced the same social shame and guilt by the offending individual woman. Yet today, all of these said social stigmas have either withered away and or become reinforced by very dull means. With the ever-changing social pressures, women have lost what was once a means to police their behavior. However, it was more than just social pressures that helped to keep women in check. If you're fortunate to be born with good parents, they too are largely responsible for teaching you honor, values, morality, and discipline. The minority of women in today's society who do hold these virtues are representative of how, despite the partial degradation of society, they still maintain personal integrity. You see, it's these examples of history that cause me to question Briffault's oversimplified law, because what else could you honestly expect from women today? Much in the same way you could ask, what else could you honestly expect from that child in our thought experiment? When women are growing up with negative behavior and even being glorified for it, we then shouldn't be surprised to see the effect of that. Additionally, while the rules for emotional hedonism are unleashed, the old social privileges that existed for women are still more or less in check, yet eroding due to their abuse. Such privileges like traditional dating, men volunteering physical protection for women, not expected to perform physical work, the tending to female frivolous discontent, crippled chivalry, lenient punishments, and being in the fortunate position to simply select from a modest quantity of pursuing lovers. The latter, of course, is never going to change due to the nature of mammalian sexual interactions. The brief list of female privileges mentioned here only act to facilitate negative behavior in overly indulgent women. These privileges essentially help to create a princess mentality in women, which I'd be willing to bet is partly responsible for selfish egotism. Much in the same way a spoilt brat is developed from a rich household when overly indulged with possessions. Incidentally, both the childish brat and the ever-aging egotistical woman eventually reach a harsh reality as time goes on. What I'm really trying to get at is that Briffault's law paints a very shallow understanding of women. Agreeably, women do have natural tendencies to engage in hypergamy, but when hypergamy is allowed to run wild, it is then the fault of people who facilitate and tolerate negative behavior in females. That said, women shouldn't be void of their own personal responsibility, and so it's about time that unbound consequences should reflect any negative behavior from women in society. With increasing content of men going their own way, I'd say this is already a positive step in resisting egotistical women. Furthermore, I want to emphasize some caution in the development or acceptance of laws within the MRM. I'm hardly an important representative of men's rights, but what I wouldn't like to see is anything akin to incorrigible feminist theory in the MRM. If you care about men's rights, then do exactly that. If you care about the study of anthropology, then do exactly that. But mixing these two can result in very dangerous outcomes if not properly met with critical thinking. Feminism, of course, is a good example of poor critical thinking with respect to the mixing of rights and the ever-development of anthropology. As of this current date, the MRM has plenty of issues to address before society. Let's not give society any reason to doubt the MRM, but instead give them reasons to help us all. As always, thanks for your attention.